Hey everybody, thanks so much for joining us today. This afternoon, I guess, for those of you joining from other time zones. I'm here in British Columbia, where it is still morning, a very foggy morning. I'm here to talk to you today about surveillance, and particularly how we can reject and refuse surveillance technologies in our classrooms. And I see this as an open education issue because for me, open is about transparency and transparently engaging with our colleagues and our students, and surveillance gets in the way of that. My name is Brenna Clark-Gray, and I'm Coordinator of Educational Technologies at Thompson Rivers University. And you'll see my contact information on the first slide. More than welcome, if you enjoy live tweeting events, please feel free and welcome to share screen captures or of anything I say today. And please feel welcome to email me afterwards if you have any questions or you'd like to follow up on anything. I do want to open by saying that I live and work on the Tecumseh-Secwépemc territory within the unceded traditional lands of Secwepemcúlecw, where learning has taken place since time immemorial. And it's really important, I think, that when we acknowledge the territory we come from, we also talk about the realities of colonialism, and resolution to the continuing trauma of colonialism begins with the return of these lands. So I encourage you to visit landback.org and learn about and perhaps donate to the Land Back movement if you feel so moved. This is an image of Knutsford, which is just to the north of Kamloops in Tecumseh-Secwépemc territory. It's a beautiful place to live and work, and I'm very lucky to be here. So today's session, what are we going to talk about? Well, basically we're going to follow what's in the session description, which is, kind of novel for me. We're going to talk about what surveillance is. I'm sure many folks on the call already have strong feelings about surveillance, and I encourage you to share those in the chat as we move through. We're going to talk a little bit about the harms associated with surveilling students, and we're going to talk about resistance and refusal. And my hope is that we leave here today with a sense of the range of options available to us, regardless of our role within the classroom. I'm going to speak particularly to the instructor's role, but that's not the only role, and I hope you'll think about resistance and refusal within your own context as well as we chat today. And I'm going to highlight three particular case studies of three different approaches to resistance and what that looks like. So why gentler in the title? This whole conversation about surveillance has been quite fractious. We know, for example, things like Proctorio's lawsuit against Ian Linkletter, who's an educational technologist from here in British Columbia. For those of you who are not familiar with that case, you can check out linkletter.org for more information about that. But effectively, Proctorio is suing Linkletter for public critique and sharing information about how Proctorio as an e-proctoring platform works. And not everyone feels up for that kind of risk, frankly, right? There's a pretty significant risk attached to taking on some of these large companies in a public sphere. I want to talk about gentleness in relation to assessment practice and our relations with our students. And I also just want to think about how resistance and refusal doesn't always have to be a public act. Yelling on the internet is not for everyone. Allegedly, it's definitely for me, but if it's not for you, sometimes it can feel like this conversation about not engaging with surveillance technologies is sort of being left to this kind of public fracas. And I want to talk about some actual, boots on the ground solutions to the question of surveillance in our classrooms that have worked, and how you can take those to your home institutions if this is an issue that you care about. So what is surveillance? It's easy to let e-proctoring take up all the oxygen from this conversation, but it's not just e-proctoring. There's all kinds of tools that track and monitor behavior that have found their way into our classrooms from K-12 right through higher ed. So we think about tools like ClassDojo, which allow teachers in K-12 primarily to sort of report on the behavior of students in their classrooms. We can talk about things like Microsoft Insights and the way Teams is all too willing to tell you all kinds of things about how your students work and what judgments you should make based on that information. We're talking about attention tracking tools, whether it's pre-pandemic Zoom with its eye tracking functionality, or some of these other tools that are said to assess attention. And it's things as simple as insisting on cameras on policies in your own classroom, right? That's a way of surveilling and monitoring what students are doing. I think that these tools are particularly insidious because they masquerade as care, right? Well, I want to know that my students are engaging. I want to know that my students are learning. These are all good things, right? They're not actually what the surveillance tools are doing though, right? Even if whether we're tracking eye movement or we're looking at what time of night a student submits an assessment, all of these things are not really measuring learning. They're measuring compliance. And something that ed tech, I say as someone who both loves and loathes educational technologies and has made it their work, ed tech is really good at offering us solutions for compliance, not so much for learning, right? And so when we buy into these technologies because we think we're demonstrating care for our students, we're ceding a lot of ground. I would argue that we're ceding a lot of ground. So when I talk about surveillance, I often go to e-proctoring first because it's sort of the sexiest example, is it? That's out there right now. But I'm thinking about all of these as a class of tools taken together. Surveillance tools are everywhere. That's probably not surprising. If you work in education, you have engaged with a surveillance tool likely. And frankly, like, let's be real, if you work in a remote environment, you are probably being tracked by some kind of surveillance tool, right? Microsoft Teams doesn't just track students, it tracks employees as well. Lots of the tools that are on our employer given computers are tracking our behavior. But when we think about e-proctoring alone, if we want to talk in numbers, e-proctoring alone was a $345 million industry in 2019, so before the pandemic hit. It's expected to reach 1.2 billion within the next 5 years. So that is like a massive exponential growth. And it's happening for a lot of reasons, right? Obviously, the pandemic kicked things off, but we're seeing, you know, a rise in remote education and students seeking remote options. Is that entirely and exclusively pandemic driven? We will find out over the next few years, right? And maybe that $1.2 billion valuation will tank. We can hope. But as it sits right now, this is a massive industry and represents massive dollars. I think this is editorialization, this is rampant surmise, but from my role in faculty support, what I see is that it's a lack of control over the classroom space as we've moved into remote learning that's really pushed for this overreach. And, you know, when you can't see your students face to face, you wonder, right? Like, of course you do, it's natural. What are they up to? Are they learning? Are they engaging with the materials? And surveillance tools are really seductive because they claim to offer you a window in. But what I encourage us to think about when we think about surveillance technology is this issue of entitlement. What are we entitled to know? And I love using the word entitled in this context because I as a millennial, as a geriatric millennial, I have spent my life hearing about how entitled I was as a student, right? Oh my goodness, so entitled. And that word kind of loses all meaning at a certain point. But when we go and we seek out information through these kinds of surveillance tools, we end up with a lot of data that maybe we don't have any right to. So, like, for example, is it reasonable to exert control over where and how students live or work? We've all seen the examples circulating on Facebook and Twitter and Reddit about instructors who don't let students eat when they're in remote classes, which they only know because they're forcing the camera to be on, right? So it's a level of control over how students live. We also know that, for example, e-proctoring tools can be really stressful to use for students who live with lots of other people, who live in multi-generational families, for example, who are themselves parents or caregivers, who don't have a quiet space where they're not being, you know, surrounded by people. As someone who spent the first 6 months of the pandemic with a 3-year-old glued to my lap, trying to do my job, I have great empathy for that situation. We also, through these tools, we attempt to exert control over things like when students complete their work, right? Microsoft Insights is very happy to tell you that little Johnny only ever submits his essays at the last minute, right? Or that he only ever opens Microsoft Word after 11 o'clock at night. And it's always presented as something that you as the instructor should intervene upon. And that is troubling to me because there's a whole larger conversation, right, before the intervention about what makes it so that little Johnny engages in his classroom activities at these time slots. And I think it's troublesome. So I see a comment in the chat about the utility of surveillance technologies. And, I think the K-12 context can sometimes be different, but I do think that as soon as we are attempting to exert influence over how students engage outside of our classroom spaces, we need to think about what that looks like. And as we have this extra information about our students' private lives, particularly in higher ed, where that's brand new, right? We've never had like a literal camera in our students' bedrooms before now. We need to think about what we're doing with that information. And I also worry about things like implicit bias. So I give the frivolous example of, when Johnny writes his essays, because I am an irritatingly inveterate morning person. I wrote my whole dissertation between the hours of 5 and 7 a.m. I love being up early. And, there's some little part of my brain that is like, people who get up early, like they're really go-getters. They're real motivated. Absolutely not true. But there is some part of my brain that feels that way, right? And so when I read that little Johnny always does his homework late at night, does that impact how I see Johnny? Does that impact how I read his work? Maybe it doesn't. But when we think about implicit bias and we think about all this extra information we have access to that we're not trained to interpret, most of us, by the way, and also that we've never had as part of our practice before, I think we need to think really critically about that piece. And at what cost, right? And there is lots of really good work on this. I point to Chris Gilliard, I point to Savasahali Singh, I point to Shay Swager, and I'm going to quote from Shay in a second. There is a lot of technological bias built in to the tools we are contracting with for large dollars. I've already said, students in difficult living situations, whether that's because they live with lots of people or because they're housing insecure and they're couch surfing or they don't have Wi-Fi or whatever, they can find it hard to accommodate the needs of, for example, an e-proctoring tool. We know from Akash Kezian's research, which is all about how the algorithm reads Black and brown faces, that students of all skin colors are not treated equitably by these technologies, particularly the AI identification technologies. We know that students with disabilities have reported issues with their needs being accommodated or their behaviors viewed as suspicious. This is particularly at issue for any students with, for example, tics or mobility issues that can be read by these surveillance technologies as suspicious, but also neuroatypical students who may look away a lot, for example, or who may stim or fidget in order to maintain attention. Those can be read incorrectly by these tools. We know gender diverse students have problems being identified, particularly if their presentation and their government ID don't match. And all students can have needs like needing to access a bathroom or a glass of water that these tools don't account for. I'm not like a super huge fan of old school proctoring at all. Like assessment design is my jam and I don't love proctored assessments in general, but at least a human proctor can let you go to the bathroom if you need to in most contexts, right? There's a story that went viral on Reddit just this morning about a young man who soiled himself during an exam and then had to sit there for 2 hours because he had been told by the instructor that if he turned off his camera, he would automatically fail the assessment. In all of these cases, right, the response from the proctoring companies, from the surveillance companies is it's not our final decision. The classroom instructor gets the final say, which is true, but this raises an issue of disclosure. What are we forcing students to disclose to us that they may not feel comfortable to do because of these third-party tools that we're contracting with? So this is a quote from Shay Swager. I'm doing that thing you're not supposed to do in PowerPoint where I read you from a quote. I do strongly recommend you check out Shay's article, which was published in Hybrid Pedagogy, Our Bodies Encoded Algorithmic Test Proctoring in Higher Education. And oh my goodness, I just read in the chat the person who threw up live on Proctorio. My God, these are not things that should be happening. I'm so sorry that you had that experience. And Amy, yes, also as a parent in this context, it's mind-boggling. Okay. Shay writes, collectively, higher education has failed to embed ethical values into educational technologies. And this is not a problem that's new to the pandemic. This is just a problem that became extremely visible in the pandemic. Algorithmic test proctoring and many technologies like it sacrifice student agency in favor of discriminatory exclusion, the pedagogy of punishment, surveillance capitalism, technological solutionism, and the eugenic gaze. Educators have an obligation to object, resist, and subvert these systems, to push towards a practice that embodies justice, liberation from love, and to remain vigilant for the next technological solution that promises to fix students or education. Love this. Shay published this article in April of 2020, really before the huge onslaught of e-proctoring that we saw. And this was, I would say, the article that radicalized me. In this article, Shay goes through the experiences of individual students and goes through discussing exactly what these technologies feel like for the people on the ground who are using them. And I think it's really quite a critical piece for anybody working in education, particularly if you use any of these kinds of tools to read, as just part of having a full and wholesome, having a full picture of what we're doing when we use these technologies. So 3 case studies in refusal I want to talk about, and I'm sort of giving them kind of general categories. The governance approach from Coast Mountain College, the assessment approach from University of Michigan Dearborn, and what I'm calling the nature is healing approach. The University of Oregon is the example I'm going to give, but there are many others. Let's start with governance. And Karen McMurray, I think I saw Karen in the waiting room, so I'm hoping she's here today. You should follow Karen on Twitter. Karen is an extremely inspirational instructor. And she started the process of dismantling surveillance at her institution by just listening to students. So she tweeted this long thread about her experiences back in the spring. I had students in business communications complain to me after class and pandemic teaching synchronous sessions about having to use surveillance software. So instead of their planned assessment, I substituted that they could write a letter about the issue to management, which, love it. They wrote the letter, but it didn't go anywhere. They were still being subjected to it, and it was awful because you set students thinking up that someone is going to hear their concerns, but no, right? And so at first you're like, well, that's a horribly disheartening story, Brenna. Thanks so much for bringing it to us. But here's where it's important. Karen is one instructor at one institution. She didn't let it go, right? Take a stand. So McMurray presented her to her education council, actually without her department support. She just went forward and did it, right? I wanted to talk to, so if you're not familiar with the governance structure in BC, why would you be? Education councils are effectively the Senate level decision-making body for colleges here in the province. Find your people. Because she spoke out, McMurray was able to find other people in her institution who were also doing the work and who also had concerns. You often don't find that out until you stand up above the parapet, unfortunately. Share the research. McMurray distributed sources on the harms of surveillance technologies to her colleagues, and then keep the faith. There were attempts to water down the messaging of what she wanted her education council to pass, but she pushed on, right? And Karen posted this on Twitter. You know, she was not actually expecting it to work. Even with that, I arrived at education council meeting today and I was not prepared to say much. I was feeling a bit sad, like this was going nowhere, but for the most part, people had done the research. They were informed and prepared. They actually opposed the motion to not support the use of surveillance software, and instead, after a brief discussion, went with ban the use of surveillance software immediately. So after finding other people who cared about the issue, sharing the relevant research and opening up the conversation, Karen Marie's institution passed a ban on surveillance technology that was actually much stronger than her original motion that she had hoped for. And so those students who first felt disempowered because their original assignment was ignored now know, first of all, that they have an instructor who is absolutely in their corner. And second of all, that the governance process can work, that when we care about these issues, we can push a little harder and a little further, and we can work together to do it. I find this story incredibly inspiring. You should follow Karen on Twitter because she's great. Okay, so my next example is assessment, and I was hoping either Sarah Silverman or Autumn Keynes might be at this session. I'm not sure that they are. If they are, wave in the chat. The assessment piece comes out of the University of Michigan, Dearborn's Office of the Provost, who really early in the pandemic, like April 2020, basically said, we're not supporting e-proctoring. It's not an option, don't do it. And at first faculty responded with frustration. And I wanna say that I get it. I 100% get it. Classes are huge. We were in absolute panic mode. You were being asked to rewrite your assessments for an entirely different modality and context. Terribly, terribly frustrating. But here's what's important. Once the values of the institution have been set, at this institution, we value stepping away from surveillance tools. What has to happen next? Well, what has to happen next is a redesign of assessment practice, right? No high stakes proctored exams. We have to do other things. We have to write open book assessments. We have to write authentic assessments. We have to shift to essay-based responses rather than multiple choice, all these kinds of things. So teaching and learning support invested their CARES Act funding in hiring instructional designers. 2 instructional designers joined the team, so that gave them a complement of 4.5. And they also spent money on graders, because we all know that more complex assessment requires more time to grade. So now those instructors not only had support designing the assessments, but they had support in grading the assessments. So that allowed them to facilitate a different kind of assessment culture at University of Michigan, Dearborn, than was previously available to faculty to access. And this comes from an article, I've got the citation for you in the next slide, by Silverman and Keynes and their colleagues. Even as teaching and learning professionals may be eager to see instructors drop high stakes exams altogether, that's me, I'm always preaching about that kind of thing. Here's the rub. It's important to recognize that changing a long-held teaching practice can feel destabilizing and will likely bring unforeseen challenges and resistance from instructors. Monetary resources saved from the refusal of remote proctoring services can be redirected to invest in ongoing faculty development on assessment and other teaching-related topics. We believe our investment in people, rather than remote proctoring services, will be more robust to the inevitable changes in learning formats and the technology that are to come. And many of us are thinking more and more about this idea of resilient pedagogy, right? I live in the interior of British Columbia. We had a pretty low-key summer COVID-wise, but we were on fire, literally. And so when we think about the kind of crises that we're going to face in the next decade, our classrooms are going to be disrupted. They're going to be disrupted over and over again by climate change, by personal issues that our students undergo. Like, crises can be global, or they can be local, or they can be personal. And as Silverman and Keynes point out here, it's investing in the human beings who can help faculty through that time, rather than the technologies that simply provide a band-aid solution to the problems, that really offers us a way forward. You can read more. Here's the citation, and I think, can I cut and paste that link? I can't, but I will. Oh, no, it's not helpful. I will. I'll post it in the chat afterwards. But you can find it if you Google for what happens when you close the door on remote proctoring. It's the first hit generally from that. And it's a really thoughtful article that talks all about the institutional pressures and the faculty concerns, as well as how they were overcome. Okay, my final mode here is what I call the nature is healing mode, which is really just the fact that we're seeing a number of schools allowing their agreements to expire, right? The pandemic is over, allegedly. We are deep in our 4th wave here in British Columbia, so it does not feel over to me, but I know in some locales we're behaving that way anyway. when we allow agreements to expire, we can do that quietly, or we can take the lead of an institution like the University of Oregon and reinforce good pedagogical practices at the same time. So this post is on the University of Oregon website, AI proctoring tools discontinued after spring 2021, an announcement from the Office of the Provost. What's interesting is they didn't just say, okay, we're getting rid of e-proctoring and you're on your own. They said, okay, we're getting rid of e-proctoring, but we hear your concerns. We know you have concerns about academic integrity issues. So here's what we're doing instead of continuing to pay for e-proctoring. We are implementing additional academic integrity supports. So in the case of University of Oregon, this looks like a module inside the learning management system that students complete. They're discouraging what I call replacement practices, which is like, we got rid of our Proctorio account, but now our professors watch our students write exams on Zoom. Instead, they've offered a stipend to support assessment redevelopment, again, recognizing the labor involved in thinking about a new assessment practice. And they've increased their exam center supports to resources to support in-person proctoring. There are some courses where proctoring is part of the deal because of licensure agreements, because of all sorts of things. And so it can be totally unrealistic to erase that as an option, depending on the community your institution serves. So in the case of Oregon, they have an exam center for their distance learning courses, and they've expanded resources there to allow access for other courses. So it's not about just saying like, we're done, woo, e-proctoring is over. It's about recognizing the needs of the community that e-proctoring was serving as a solution to and adjusting accordingly. So what are the lessons we can learn from these examples? Well, first of all, it doesn't have to be fractious. Resisting surveillance technology doesn't just look like yelling on the internet, although, I mean, that part is fun. So I recommend it if you haven't tried it. But we can see how walking away from surveillance tools can be collaborative, right? In the Coast Mountain College example, McMurray was able to find other colleagues who felt the same way and cared about the same issues as she did. In the example of University of Michigan Dearborn, we see that, hang on, my phone is moving. In the example of University of Michigan Dearborn, we see an expanded teaching and learning center, right? Again, collaborative, not fractious. The work of resistance can help recenter a campus on the needs of students. I think that piece is really, really important. We see that in the statement from Oregon, and we see that in lots of other places. So that's really critical too. Pandemic pedagogies don't have to be made permanent. That's the lesson out of Oregon, right? Is just because we decided on the solution for a hot minute when it felt really necessary, we don't have to stay on that road. I think that is really important because the thing about ed tech, especially like not so ethical ed tech, is it looks for any crack in the foundation and it's like a weed, right? It's like it gets in, and once it's in, it's like, well, you know, you've got a 5-year agreement, you might as well keep me around. We can allow these agreements to lapse, and we can choose a different path going forward. And then finally, and most importantly, in these examples, particularly in the example from University of Michigan and from Oregon, we see a recognition that walking away from these tools requires resourcing. So surveillance tools are typically Band-Aid solutions. They're Band-Aid solutions for large classes. They're Band-Aid solutions for overworked faculty. Those problems need to be resolved. You can't just say, okay, we'll go redesign all your assessments without support and expect that that will fly. That's when we end up with things like, you know, people with the replacement proctoring on Zoom and that kind of thing, right? Folks need appropriate resources in place. So what can the average instructor do? If you're an average individual working in post-secondary, and I don't think this is just instructors, I think this can extend certainly to administrators and teaching and learning support, but also I think students can have a huge voice. I know on our campus, our big move towards OER was really strongly a response to students requesting it. And I think students could have a large voice on the issue of surveillance technologies as well. So what can we do? We can challenge, right? Institutional norms are not immutable. They change all the time, right? If the last 20 months have taught us nothing, I hope they've taught us that. Refuse where you can, right? And this is going to be dependent on your own precarity and power, but where you have power, build space for refusal and ask the appropriate questions that create that space. I mean, that's what happened at Coast Mountain College. That was one instructor responding to what her students were telling her about how surveillance technology made them feel. And that was the germ that started it all. An average instructor can revise assessments, right? And hopefully you have the support of a good teaching and learning unit at your institution, but if not, there are tons of people online who want to help too. Revise assessments to minimize the need for proctoring of any sort and lean into high integrity assessment practices like reflection. Again, this is going to be shaped by your context, by your disciplinary norms, by your class size, by your time, but where it's possible, I encourage you to try. And then the big one for me is just ignore the data you shouldn't have access to. If you don't need, for true pedagogical reasons, to know when Johnny logs into Teams, don't look at that information. Ignore it and try really hard not to make it part of your practice. Normalizing surveillance, it happens so quickly and so easily, and it's something we really need to push back against as best we can. So I encourage you today to think about what resistance could look like for you. You're welcome to share those thoughts in the chat. I'm just getting to our question period, or you can just hold on to that question for your own reflection and take it away with you. But we've seen a wide range of examples today of what resistance can look like. And I hope that there's something in there that resonates with you and your own experience and where you sit on campus. And as always, I encourage you to follow up. You can find me on Twitter at Brenna C. Gray or bgray@tru.ca on email. And in both cases, that is Gray with an A. But yeah, we've got, I think, 8 minutes left in the session, Lisa, am I right? So we can open up to questions. Please feel free. I assume you can all unmute yourselves. Please feel free to do so or to ask questions in the chat.
Hi, Brenna. I put a question in the chat.
Oh, great. Justin.
Do you have any resource lists on hand for helping faculty redesign assessments? I want to put this into our OER course redesign. Currently, we allow people to keep using courseware because we don't have the graders, right? So if we could give more redesign support, maybe we could say, okay, you can only do the stipend if you're going to redesign without courseware. And I think that might be something we could start doing next year.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I have some resources here that we first posted online at the beginning of the pandemic, and it has some resources on how to create open book assessments and how to create those kinds of things. It's a little bit emergency focused because that's when we built it for sure. And then we also have a resource somewhere on authentic assessments, but that one might take me a second to pull up. But yeah, I'll try to find it before the end of the session, Justin. Thanks for asking. Oh, Mary, this is a really good question. Tips for resisting surveillance that students actually like using. Some of the complementary learning materials are so insidious in the way that their convenience allows them to collect materials on students that may not even be shared with instructors. Yeah, courseware, what Justin just mentioned, right? This sounds like courseware to me. Courseware is my, if there was one thing I could kill in higher education, I'm not even sure it would be e-proctoring. I think it would be courseware because you're right, it is super insidious and it's so slick and glossy that compared to some of the other alternatives, students really do find it appealing. I don't like to think it's my job to tell students what they do and don't like. But I have noticed that the more information students have about how these companies track and sell their data, the less enthusiastic they are about it. So every year here at TRU, and definitely following in the footsteps of Middlebury, we do a digital detox. And we've often had the engagement of a digital sociology class in that, and it's been really interesting to have the opportunity to chat with students about this issue. I'm just trying to pull up our essay on courseware, because the students really responded to it. And I think that helping them find that information can be really valuable. And I see, oh, Kate, thank you so much for linking those articles in the chat. I really appreciate it. Let's see here. I think it's this one. Posting that in the chat as well. But I think opening up the door for those conversations, and particularly opening up the door for those conversations with student unions, who can then carry the torch and help students get involved and care. The other wedge for courseware is that it's expensive as heck, right? And so oftentimes resistance around courseware comes from that angle. And I think that faculty should embrace and support those issues as well. Thanks for asking. Thank you both. Any other questions or comments or thoughts? Okay, well then I will just say thank you so much for coming and spending some time with me today and thinking about these issues. I hope that you will think about how they work in your own context. And I really love talking about this stuff. So I encourage you to follow up with me if you have any other thoughts or you just want to discuss these ideas a little bit more. I appreciate it. So thanks so much for your time.